Hi guys, welcome to chapter 13. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at, since we just finished up this week looking at our nervous system, our senses are now very much part of the nervous system because of the nerves and the pathways that connect things like our eyes to our brain and our ears to our brain and things like that. So we're going to look at some things that go along with our senses, whether it be our general senses like pain and touch, or our special senses like sight and taste and smell. So we're going to take a look at all of that today. So here in chapter 13. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys so we can walk through the PowerPoint together. This one is a little bit longer. This is the one that does include some labeling that I'm going to walk you guys through. I do want you guys to focus on the eye and the ear, as those are two pretty intense organs, and I want you guys to know some of the parts for that. In your book and your PowerPoint, go through that, and then I've got a labeling diagram within this PowerPoint that I'm actually going to walk you through, and also I've included it in your review sheets section in Brightspace. So let me go ahead and walk you guys through all of that. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning of chapter 13. We're going to take a look in this first section. We're going to look at the functions of our sensory system. We're going to look at the 5 different types of sensory receptors. So whether we're talking about, again, your general senses or your special senses, whether it's touch or taste, doesn't matter. There are a couple different types of receptors in our body. We're going to look at the 4 components involved in the perception of a sensation and some different characteristics of sensation. We're going to look at our 5 general senses as well as the special senses of smell and taste. And like I said, we're also going to look at, in a separate section, we'll look at sight and sound. Okay. So let's take a look. So our sensory system allows us to experience the world, right? The reason why I'm able to really experience everything is because I can see everything, I can hear everything, I can touch things, I can taste foods. We're able to experience the world that way. So external information like the sound of a barking dog, or even internal information. So the sudden change in our blood pressure, there's a sensory network within our body that's able to pick up on different internal changes, and they can send those messages to our brain, so our brain can then learn to react however we need to react. And again, that's how we're maintaining homeostasis. If you remember day 1, we talked about homeostasis. So if there are things that we need to adapt to and change to make sure that our body stays at an internal stable environment, our sensory system is going to help us with that. So our cells that detect these stimuli, we have receptors. If you remember in our nervous system, we talked about receptors. Excuse me, a receptor is what's receiving a sensation, a change of some sort, whether it be the light turning on. I'm going to have what's called photoreceptors that respond to light in the back of my eye. I have thermoreceptors in my skin that help to respond to heat. I have, and these are all listed here for us, but those are what receptors are. They respond to changes in our world. So that's what they are. They're a specialized area of a sensory neuron that detects the stimulus. And again, the stimulus is the different changes that I'm explaining. So whether it be, like I said, a sight of some sort, or a sound, it could be a smell, and it could be a touch. So here are 5 different types of receptors. We have chemoreceptors, just as that prefix there implies for us. Chemo, meaning that it responds to different chemical changes. So when we talk about smell or taste, both our tongue and even we have receptors in our nose that respond to chemical changes. So when we take a bite of something, we can detect whether it's something sweet or sour or savory because of the different chemoreceptors on my tongue that can pick that up. Then we have pain receptors, sometimes referred to as nociceptors. Nociceptors, I keep saying receptor. Noci meaning pain. So in that aspect, we're looking at if somebody were to hit me in the shoulder, I can pick up on that pain sensation. We have pain sometimes felt internally as well. If we have some different things going on internally, there are some pain receptors inside of our body. So we'll find, and we'll talk a little bit later about locations of some of our receptors. As I mentioned in my example, that there are thermoreceptors. We have different thermoreceptors in various parts of our body that respond to changes in temperature. So responding to heat or cold, it responds to that temperature. And in some cases may help us to react if it's a pretty extreme heat. Again, we'll discuss that a little bit later too. Mechanoreceptors, which are going to help our body to respond to movements, so different movements within the body or movements outside the body. The fact that I can raise my arm and I know where my hand is, even without looking at it, is because I can detect movements. And then we have photoreceptors. Photoreceptors are going to respond to light, and we'll find those when we discuss our eye in a little bit. So we're going to talk about all of these a little bit further, but those are all the different receptors that we have in our body. There are 4 components to any type of sensation. Again, there's a stimulus of some sort. In the example we're looking at in this picture, the stimulus is the light that we're seeing, so a change in light. So the sun coming up, or again, if somebody flipped on the light switch, I'll be able to see that change in the room. But this, is just referring to this one, but it could be, again, somebody starts singing a song. And so that's the stimulus, the sound of that song. The receptor is then what receives that stimulus. So in this example, we're talking about photoreceptors in the back of the eyeball that are going to pick up on that change. Then we have that message. Again, it hasn't actually been perceived as the sun coming up just yet. Instead, our brain is going to help to translate that for us. And this, again, with any nerve sensation, it happens very rapidly. So we know that as soon as the light turns on, we know that we immediately recognize that. But it happens because of this process. The stimulus that, again, has occurred, the receptor picks up on that and then sends that to a sensory nerve behind that receptor. That sensory nerve is then what's going to carry that to the location in the brain. In this example, since we're talking about sight, that is again received by the occipital lobe in our cerebrum, and that occipital lobe is going to interpret that as what it is and tells my body that I'm looking at the sun coming up. And like I said, in any type of sensation, those messages are sent through this pathway: stimulus, receptor, nerve, brain. And that's going to help us to then, if it's something we need to react to, or it's going to help us to just determine what it is that we're responding to, or that we're seeing or hearing or tasting. So there are 2 characteristics of sensation. We have what's called projection and adaptation. And we're going to talk about these in the next 2 slides right here. So projection, and what projection is, the brain is referring sensation back to its source. So we have, like, for instance, the ordinary injury of some sort. If in the example that I'm hammering a nail and I miss the nail and I hit my thumb, well, that's a pretty ordinary injury. What that pain is going to be projected to the thumb then. We're going to feel that sensation in the thumb because that's where the hammer hit. It may be a terrible pain depending on how hard I was swinging that hammer, but that's in response to an ordinary injury. The pain is referring to that particular site. But this is a great example of the phantom limb sensation. And some of you guys may have heard this, that in the event that someone has to lose a limb, they have to maybe have in this example, we're looking at a foot, maybe they have to have their foot amputated because of nerve pathways in our body and what our body is used to as far as where nerves are going to go and how they project and how they're connected to the brain. A lot of times people who are amputees oftentimes still experience pain or feel that pain in the limb that is missing because of that nerve pathway. The nerve, again, is translating that and experiencing pain in the foot, even though the foot is not there. And that's oftentimes referred to as phantom limb pain. And again, it has everything to do with how that pain is being projected because of the nerve pathways. Adaptation, so with continuous stimulation, sensory receptors sometimes become less responsive. What happens is they adapt. In a lot of situations, we adapt to things, meaning that we kind of learn to deal with it, right? So a great example would be like smell. So as it mentions in the next bullet point there, receptors vary in their ability to adapt. This is only, in certain cases. Smell and temperature adapt very well. Pain, not at all. And that's for a very good reason. What I mean by adapt, imagine, and you guys I'm sure have all experienced this, Imagine you walk into a room and there is, let's say, a vanilla candle burning in the room. You walk into the room and you get this overwhelming sensation of vanilla, right? You've got that candle burning, it smells phenomenal. Let's say you sit in there for about 20 minutes and that smell is not as strong as it was when you first walked in. Let's say you have to then use the restroom. You go to the restroom, you're gone for about, let's say 5 minutes, you come back and that overwhelming sensation of vanilla is there again. That is because your olfactory receptors, which we'll talk about when we talk about the nose, those are the receptors that are located in our nose itself. They are adapting. They adapt to that smell. They kind of get used to it. They know that it's there at the beginning, and it's not that it's not there anymore. It's just that our nose adapts to it. And that's why when we leave and we're not in that area of that scent anymore, when we come back in, it's like it's brand new again. And that's what adaptation is. Our smell and our temperature receptors are very good at doing that. Oftentimes we adapt to temperatures, and sometimes we adapt to temperatures because of responses. In cases of like extreme heat, we talked about this with our skin, we adapt because we sweat, and sometimes that sweat is causing that heat to leave our body, and therefore we are adapting to the temperature. So those are some receptors that adapt very well. Pain receptors, however, do not adapt at all. And again, for very good reason. Most of the time, pain is helping us to respond in a certain way. Imagine, I've used this example, I used it in the last chapter, when I lay my hand on a very hot stove, if I couldn't feel pain, my hand would burn off. It would be terrible for my hand. So instead, the reason why we feel pain and why that pain receptor doesn't adapt to it is because my body needs to learn how to respond to that. And again, because of that, we know to remove my hand immediately. And I still may feel some pain in my hand, but it doesn't adapt because it's telling the body how to heal. In a case where, let's say I really burn my hand and I now have, maybe a situation where I have some tissue missing on my finger. In that case, the pain is still going to be there because my body needs to know to heal that site. It's going to send blood and white blood cells and platelets and everything. We'll talk about blood next week. But it's going to send all those types of cells to the site to try and overcome that pain by healing. And the reason that pain is there is because it's telling my body to respond the right way. So that's why pain doesn't have that type of adaptation. But that's what adaptation is. So I do want you guys to be familiar with those two terms, projection and adaptation. So we have different general senses. So we talked about our receptors and the general, the receptors we have in our body, whether we're talking about general senses or special senses. These are called general senses. When we get to things like smell and taste, those are called special senses. We have general senses. These particular senses are kind of located all over the body. Receptors for pain, touch, pressure, temperature, and proprioception, which is understanding where body movements are occurring. So pain, again, we know that it can be felt all over the body, whether it's internally or externally. We respond to touch. We'll talk about where all the receptors are located for these guys. Pressure, again, if somebody is pushing up against me, I can, feel that sensation of pressure. Temperature, again, we know that we, can adapt to certain temperatures. But again, whether it's really hot out or really cold, there are temperature receptors. And then, like I said, proprioception, which is understanding the body movements. So movements that occur internally and externally. So this is showing that particular picture of these different general senses. So pain, again, we feel pain pretty much everywhere, but there's an example of somebody touching a thumbtack. Touch, so petting a kitten there, so touching, and we can feel that the cat is soft. Pressure, so in this example, we can tell that this bowling ball is very heavy because of the pressure sensation that we can pick up on. And then thermoreception, so heat and cold. So temperature change or temperature senses, and then there's the proprioception. Again, even though this man's eyes are closed, he understands because of the movement in our body that we can detect. He understands and knows that his hands are over his head, not just because he put them there, but because we have nerves that tell us there's a sensation there that tells us where our arms are at this time. So that's our those are our 5 general senses. We're going to talk a little bit about those. So our pain receptors, also called nociceptors, they consist of free nerve endings stimulated by different things. So there's tissue injury. So again, in the event that somebody touched that thumbtack in that picture that I was just showing you guys, so therefore there might be some injury to the tissue. Chemicals, so sometimes chemicals can therefore cause pain, whether it's on the surface or maybe even internally. We've maybe swallowed something we shouldn't have. Or tissue hypoxia, which is a tissue not receiving the amount of oxygen that it should. Next week, when we talk about blood, we'll talk about how the role of blood, or one of the roles of blood, is to deliver oxygen to all of our tissues. And if oxygen doesn't get to our tissues, if it's cut off of that oxygen supply, it can cause a lot of damage to that tissue. A prime example would be if our arteries do not deliver blood. If, say, there's some type of blood clot in the pathway back to our heart. If blood supply does not reach our heart, we experience heart attacks. So that tissue hypoxia just means that not receiving the oxygen that it needs. So this is, these pain receptors are widely distributed throughout the skin, as well as viscera, which is just different surroundings around our organs. So within our organs too, other tissue and other internal tissues. So throughout the body, we can receive that sensation of pain. And again, remember, pain receptors do not adapt for the reasoning, again, like I mentioned earlier, that we have to learn how to respond. We don't want pain sensation to adapt, otherwise it could cause a significant amount of damage to whatever tissue is experiencing that pain. So in speaking of pain, these are different sites of what's called referred pain. Sometimes based on what is happening internally, sometimes we refer pain to different areas of the body. So for example, if somebody is experiencing a heart attack, so here is the location of the heart. Sometimes people, based on experience, if they're having something going on with their heart, sometimes they experience pain throughout the entire arm, and that's sometimes because of the location there of the heart. But with the gallbladder, your gallbladder is located very close to right in here. So cholecystitis, which is an inflammation of the gallbladder itself, can sometimes be felt right within this area. But sometimes even the gallbladder issues can sometimes be felt in the shoulder, which seems kind of strange, but it's a way that our body sometimes refers pain. Sometimes, and you all may have heard this before, that sometimes people, when they experience a heart attack or a stroke, sometimes feel pain in certain areas within the body. And it could be a sign that that person is experiencing that tissue hypoxia, meaning the cut off oxygen supply to either their brain or their heart. And so that's what that's showing you. And appendicitis, your appendix is actually located in a very similar area. So it's referring to, kind of close by. But pancreatitis, your pancreas is right here. So a little bit above that, sometimes it's referred to a different area of the body. So that's what that is. Referred pain is just pain that's sometimes in a different area of where that organ is. And so there's a lot of different signs that point to that particular organ that could be experiencing some kind of issues, even though that pain is nowhere near that tissue. We have touch and pressure receptors. Touch, or what's called sometimes tactile receptors, are mechanoreceptors. Again, we talked about the different types of receptors. They are found mostly in the skin. So the fact that we can, again, in that example where somebody was petting that cat, we can pick up the sensation of soft because, again, the receptors in my skin. Whereas pressure receptors, again, we can feel the sensation of that heavy bowling ball, or if somebody was pressing up against me, those are still mechanoreceptors, meaning that they are, again, mechanics or movements of the body, but located within not just the skin, but as well as subcutaneous tissue, as well as even deeper tissue. Again, thinking about with somebody's pressing up against me, that's going to be felt beyond the skin, so a little bit deeper than the skin. Thermoreceptors, these are receptors for cold and for heat, located in free nerve endings and other specialized sensory cells within the skin. They do have a quick adaptation. We respond pretty quickly, based on what we tell our body to do. And heat, I was telling you the example that we tell our body to sweat, and sweat will then help us to remove heat. So it's a pretty quick adaptation. However, temperature extremes are experienced as pain, and we don't want that to adapt, like we were talking about earlier. So, like an example would be if I'm standing close to a bonfire. A bonfire, obviously, we're going to respond to that as heat, and we might be in the bonfire because we're cold, and it's heating our body up and helping us to prevent from being too cold. But what if we get too close to the bonfire? And what if I actually now touch the bonfire? You guys are thinking, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Well, yeah, now we experience pain. That thermoreceptor in my hand went from thermo to pain receptor because we're picking up now a change that we ourselves need to adapt to. So pain, again, is not going to adapt. We instead need to respond to that pain. So that's what they mean by the temperature extremes will be experienced as pain. In proprioception, so this is the sense of orientation or position in space. So in that picture example that was, on that slide before and in your text, the example with the man standing over with his hands over his head, there are receptors in our body that are going to receive that sensation and understand that there has been movement in the body. So it's located in different muscles, tendons, joints, and even in the inner ear. We have changes that occur in our inner ear, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the ear, to help us to detect different movements. When our head moves, we'll talk about how the movements can be detected in our ear, and that's what helps us to maintain balance. So we'll get into that. So the sensory information here is going to be translated by the parietal lobe and the cerebellum. If you remember, the cerebellum was that part in the back of our head, or the back of our brain, I'm sorry, that helps to detect balance. So sensory information in both the parietal lobe and also the cerebellum. All right, and then we have our 5 special senses. So our special senses, again, detected by the brain and connected directly to the brain. We have smell and taste. And then we also are going to focus a little bit heavily on sight, hearing, and balance today. I'm going to have you guys, when we talk about the eye and the ear, and that kind of goes together with hearing and balance, we'll talk about those as our special senses. So we'll get into that. So starting with our sense of smell, smell is what's called olfaction. We have what's called olfactory receptors. So I do want you guys to be familiar with olfaction, meaning smell. These are chemoreceptors. So again, because they're able to receive the sensation of chemical changes, whether it's the smell of that vanilla burning candle, or if it's the smell of a diaper being changed, a baby's diaper being changed. So whether it's a good smell or a bad smell, either way, we're picking up on the different chemical changes in the air. So they are our nasal tissue. You all do not have to know the specific cranial nerves. When we talked about the brain, I thought that would be a lot for you guys to be familiar with. It is good to be familiar with if you guys know that, but I'm not going to test you guys on these. I don't think it's anything that, you guys need to stress too much on. It might be something that as you guys get deeper into your nursing classes, you guys might get a little bit heavier into the specific cranial nerves. But we'll talk about a couple today that you might, just by me leaving them on the PowerPoint here, you might be more familiar with. But there are 12 cranial nerves that are attached to the brain, as again, the name implies that, the cranial nerves. And those 12 cranial nerves are all connected to different things and help us to pick up on different special senses. So specifically, the sense of smell will travel on cranial nerve 1. Again, like I said, there's 12 of them, so they're named according to that number. And so that cranial nerve 1 will then transmit that back to the temporal lobe, where the temporal lobe will interpret that. So we talked, when we talked about the brain in chapter 10, right before this video, you may remember that I talked about how the temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, but it is also responsible for the sense of smell as well. Whereas our gustatory sense is called taste. So gustation is the sensation of taste itself. So we have taste receptors located on our tongue. These are known as chemoreceptors. We know, again, just like the ones that are interpreting smell, or receiving smell, they're receiving chemical changes, but now that we are tasting. So nerve impulses move along 3 different cranial nerves from our tongue for gustatory. But I didn't name those. You don't have to worry about the specific cranial nerves, but they will be then transmitted back to the parietal and the temporal lobe. So the sense of taste will be interpreted in the parietal lobe of our cerebrum as well as the temporal lobe. All right, and then this just shows you our different taste sensations that we can pick up on: bitter, sour, salty, sweet, and then some also will also add in the savory taste, or what sometimes people call umami. So if you ever have heard of that particular taste, it's just very similar to savory. Okay. All right, so let's get into sight and hearing. So sight and hearing, we're going to look a little bit heavier into the eye and the ear. And I tell you what, let's break this video up. I'm going to actually stop this video here, so you guys will go ahead and stop it. Just it makes it easier to upload these videos, and then you guys can kind of watch them at your own pace, but I'll make a separate video just for sight and hearing. So there will be some more labeling involved in this one. So go ahead and move on to that one then. All right, guys, let me go ahead and stop that here. All right, go ahead and move on to that video.